19th century historian Johann Huizinga famously said that the exaggerated formality and romanticism of the late medieval court society was a defense mechanism. It was a way of steeling oneself against the increasing brutality of European civilization as it was evolving. He described it largely as a period of pessimism and decadence rather than the slow ascent into the Renaissance that makes a somewhat more pleasing story. The elaborate constructions of the art at this time, of the highly allegorical, often quite literally Byzantine formulations over what would become humanism was well, it is a curious aspect of the art, and it makes it often quite difficult to see through. And the notion that you have to see through is sometimes hard to get a hold of, because we're so inundated with ideas of, okay, knights in shining armor, and lords and ladies, and Merlin and the whole round table and all of this stuff. It's come down to us as a kind of legendary, literally legendary inheritance of culture. But all of this, it needs to be understood, was a kind of frothy overlay on what was underneath some very troubling and brutal conditions. This was late Middle Ages. This is scary stuff. The images of courtly love that we so revel in, of the beautiful damsels, the princesses, the knights leaning or kneeling before them in a kind of reverence, as if they were approaching a goddess on earth, the representative of God in the Great Lady. It is, in a way, a kind of farce of human behavior, because this image of the knight on his knees before the lady, vowing duty and total subjugation out of a idealized kind of devotion, it's entirely desexualized. There's nothing particularly, there's no consummation at the end of that. It is just about the service to the ideal in the form of the lady. And it is it is all kind of a elaborate game. It can be a game that is meant to deflect some of the sexual energies of a bunch of, rowdy knights who, during the winter months, when a lot of this tends to take place, have nothing much to do once the fighting ends. But it is very much all surface. There is something lacking in its humanity until you start to question why. And the perspective of Huizinga, I think, is instructive here, because it is a defense mechanism. It is a overcompensation, if anything, trying to come up with a alternative to the brutal conditions that they faced in everyday life. If your job as a knight is to go out and club and spear and hack to pieces another knight from a neighboring village serving a different lord, well, your life can be rather hard, brutish, and short. A game helps keep it all light. A diversion. And it reminds you constantly that the artificiality of everything that you're doing. It's like, yeah, we're all just having a good time here, while underneath is some really harrowing reality that is a kind of refuge psychologically. It's a conspicuous artificiality that reminds you of the ultimate falseness of the world, because everything you see is supposed to be pointless, supposed to be false, supposed to be the waiting room that we all have to endure before moving on to the divine realm. That's the perspective. And I would say that this comes out as a kind of allegory in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is a relatively late entry in the Arthurian tradition. Arthurian legends are usually are generally known as the Matter of Britain, a body of work that extends over several centuries, from the Middle Ages, when Arthur was already supposedly rather old, all the way through, or as a story, all the way through. At this point, the Gawain and the Green Knight comes out. We don't know the author, but it's generally agreed that the manuscript, the story, was contemporary with Chaucer, and they were just two English poets working on different sides of the island, let's say. Sir Gawain comes to us in a single manuscript on which three other poems of note were also written. There was one that is quite popular named Pearl. There's another named Purity, and another named Patience. And you can see just in those titles a heavy Christianizing theme running through. And they are all of one form or another rather moralistic. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a bit of a standout in that. It is inarguably a Christian poem, but it deals very explicitly with its its pagan heritage, its Celtic heritage specifically. The poems were all written in a dialect that researchers have traced to the West Midlands area of England. The scholar and Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien, actually, who is a brilliant linguist and philologist, studied the patterns, came up with not just the general West Midlands area, which is roughly bordering the northeast corner of Wales, but he pinpointed to, well, within, right around the county of Cheshire. He's really pinpointing it based on just the evidence he sees on the page and what he knows to be the language patterns in that area. This is very Western England. It is almost Wales, and if anybody who's ever gone driving in England, you land in London, you rent the car, and you start driving west, and these signs get conspicuously harder to read as you go along because they start printing them in the original Welsh as well. And so you could have an English word that is very easy for, we Yanks to understand, and then suddenly there's a word with 30 consonants in a row, and half of them aren't from our alphabet. It's a mouthful. So it's a very different linguistic tradition, and it is, while this is contemporary with Chaucer, you can get your way through, as a modern reader of English, you can get your way through Chaucer's Middle English, as it was called then, but it's almost impossible for a layman, as you would say, to just pick up Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in its original and start picking its way through. We do have some good translations, though, to work from. Tolkien himself wrote an excellent one. Simon Armitage has another very good one. These are all fine, and of course, nothing is like the original, but you can compare and contrast between the two, and it can be fun. So, the story of Arthur is fairly well known from other sources. Chrétien de Troyes very famously comes up with a giant load of the material, and so does Sir Thomas Malory. A lot of that material tends to focus more on the French aspects of it. France was the big linguistic dog in the neighborhood, let's say. And at this time, this is only a couple of hundred years after the Norman invasion, it is still a very heavy French influence. You can see that in Chaucer, who could read French and went to France many times. But as you get further away into the western part of England, it is less of an influence, and they are more influenced by the Celtic, the Welsh, the Irish, even some of the Scots up north to a degree. So it is linguistically a very different reality that they are dealing with there, and the character of the poem itself, I would say, is also propelling a certain anti-French nationalism. Well, not so much anti-French, but it's promoting, let's say, the English Celtic traditions over the romantic French, Romanized traditions. That's one of the reasons the hero is Gawain, a very, Celtic name, as opposed to Lancelot, who of course comes famously from France. So you get some of that, and some of the attitudes that you see, I would say, suggest that kind of self-conscious Englishness that is affirming itself in some opposition to those dirty Frenchmen. It is very much about the glory of England, as all of the Arthurian tales are, creating this legendary figure and his civilization around him and celebrating it as a rallying point of English identity. But it is also a critique of that, where it is trying to question some of the assumptions that you may have about the English character in general, the Arthurian tradition in particular, and this whole legend, myth, whatever you want to call it, built around the idea of the chivalric code, courtly love, all of the art of courtly love and Andreas Capellanus and all of that conception that is a great ideal. But if you look at poems like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it becomes somewhat unrealistic and even almost, in a sense, sacrilegious. It is also famously, just a couple more points before we jump into the poem itself, the poetry itself, in a kind of show of allegiance with its Celtic heritage, is alliterative. It is part of what is known as the alliterative revival, technically. Earlier Celtic and some, and British poetry would be more, what was generally more alliterative in general. It worked with stresses and similar consonant sounds punched throughout a line. That's what distinguished a line. And you see this in Beowulf, for instance. But the French influence, when that came in, well, in France and the Romanesque, let's say, tradition, well, they really preferred rhyme. And so they made their poetry built around rhyme. And here we're seeing a very conscious and deliberate decision to not go there. We don't want to do rhyme, we're going to do alliteration. It's just another way of, it's all just mnemonic devices, quite frankly, for remembering how to spin out a line when you're called upon to recite it. But here, it's you get the sense that it's also a somewhat, again, nationalistic thing, where they're waving like, no, we're not going to do as all those fancy people over in London, like Mr. Chaucer, do. We're going to do something from here in the heartland of England, in the West Midlands. There's a certain provincial quality to that is kind of charming. It is 2,530 lines divided into 101 stanzas, and from there broken down into 4 chapters, or fits as they're called, F-I-T-T-S. And these themselves have their own symmetry of sorts. There is a pattern to them. Fit number 1 and 4 deal with the battle between Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and in between there is an interlude where it deals with where you have Gawain dealing with Sir Bertilac and his wife. And there's also internal symmetries between at one point there are 3 hunts, and that is counterposed with 3 seduction sequences, I guess you could say. There are all these little internal dynamics that show a very conscious interweaving of patterns, very much like the complex patterns that artists of the time in the Middle Ages generally gravitated towards. Those patterns that make you just awestruck at the intricacy of them, at the complexity of them, at the impenetrability of them, and as such, essentially mirror the experience of confronting God, or at least God through nature. Because you look around the world and you see all of this stuff going on, and it's also mysterious because you don't know what's going on. There's not a whole lot of science at this point in history. But you're sitting there trying to figure it all out, and by puzzling it through, you are trying to grasp the subtle interweavings of the mind of God, God's intention. And reading complicated poetry or studying complicated art was supposed to sharpen your mental tool for doing that. If you could read a complex poem and understand it, you were that much more likely to be able to glance around and be able to make some reasonable deductions about what God had on his mind. We don't need to get into too much more complicated stuff. The poem begins at Christmas time. Everybody loves a good Christmas story. It is Christmas time, and the entire Knights of the Round Table are gathered around in the hall for King Arthur. Arthur is there, Guinevere is there, and they're having a big Christmas party. The hall is very important in English tradition, in the Celtic tradition, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. It is the hall is the seat of government. It is the seat of society. It's where the king presides, but it's really where the entire community gathers, because in this era the king could be really just, you know, leading back to Anglo-Saxon forebears and the Vikings and all that. A king could very easily be just a tribal warlord who has a dozen or so followers. But if he has a nice hall, that's a place for them all to come together, especially in the wintertime when it's cold out. They can all come together, stay warm, enjoy some fellowship, create real bonds. And so the hall is very important. And that's where they are at the beginning of this poem at Christmas time. Automatically, you know, they're not necessarily doing Secret Santa or anything like that, but there is a immediate association with Christianity in this. But significantly, and especially at this time, Christianity was kind of an add-on to certain pagan Celtic traditions about Christmas, and the whole tree thing comes from Germany, and all of those traditions are very, very intertwined. So it's hard to say that, well, Christmas, that's all about Christianity. It's not that subtle. It is a very complex knot of meaning just in that. And this gets more complicated with just the way the poem begins, because it begins by heralding the glorious heritage that they share as descendants from Troy. And the poet conveys this, this legendary history, there's no evidence of it whatsoever, that the real founder of Britain was a guy named Felix Brutus, who was a descendant of Aeneas, who went on to, after leaving Troy, after the fall of Troy, went on to found Rome. And his exploits are, of course, the famous poem, the Aeneid. So you're starting on a pagan note on a Christian holiday, so automatically that's a little bit, you know, okay, I see where we're going here. It's also a sense of somewhat grandiose aspirational heritage. Again, there's no evidence that there's, you know, this guy Felix Brutus just grew up in Rome or whatever and said, hey, I think I'm going to go found Britain. London was founded by the Romans as a city. London was. There were already people living there, but, you know, victors write the history. But the idea of tying yourself as a people to not just, well, yeah, sure, we were the furthest outpost of the Roman Empire for a while there, and one they gave up pretty quick, to the assumption that, well, clearly we are all descendant from Aeneas himself. That's a bit grandiose. That's a bit taking shelter in a puffed up legend to try and build yourself up as an exercise in pride. It's this wonderful little complex of perspectives that you're getting in here, where you're told to consider it, you know, as Trojans, but it's not, nobody thinks that's real. That's not, you know, that's not a thing. And it's not all necessarily glorious either. The first stanza ends in the little bob and wheel portion at the bottom in the Armitage. It says that, you know, on Britain's broad ranks most grand, and wonder, dread, and war have lingered in that land, where loss and love in turn have held the upper hand. That sounds more troubling. So you start with Troy is in the very first line. Beginnings and endings are always important. Troy is in the very first line, and then you get down to, you know, wonder, dread, and war have lingered in that land. Well, that doesn't sound great. That doesn't sound necessarily glorious. I mean, wonder, dread, and war. Tolkien translates that as strange things, strife, and sadness. Strange things is pretty weak as poetry goes, but strife and sadness, now we're getting like downright melancholy. Um, it's after the blaring Troy fades, you start to get down underneath it. You dig through that stanza and you end on a very different note, suggesting that within the glory that dazzles, well, maybe there's some trouble. Maybe it's not all hunky-dory on the homestead. They introduce Arthur and the knights. We're told that the gang's all there for Christmas. It was Christmas at Camelot. And King Arthur is fairly young at this point. I think that's significant. This is relatively new. Everything's quite glorious and adventurous, and everybody looks pretty good because they're all young. Arthur gets much older in some of the other tales. And they're all just enjoying one another's company. There is community and fellowship in this hall, all roundly carousing and reveling in pleasure. They're having a good time. They're enjoying the fact that they are all together in the hall. They have community. They have a sense of abundance. There was the feasting lasted a full fortnight in one day, with more food and drink than a fellow could dream of. Everything's good. This is all great. And they're all just sitting back at the beginning of winter, after the fighting season has ended. There's nothing to do. And they're just enjoying being the round table. Hey, everybody, we're number one. We are preeminent. We're the round table, guys. Yeah. They're not doing anything other than just laying around, eating and drinking right now, goofing off. Now, I assume during the fighting months of the summer and the fall that they were working very hard to secure Arthur's reign, put down trouble spots, maybe even go out and do a crusade or two here and there. But they're clearly in a position where they're just, they're just enjoying the spoils of that activity, the fruits of war. The traditions of courtly life are very much observed, and Arthur is particularly solicitous of them. He says, in a custom with chivalry and the code of service that is so important within that, he has certain rules for these dinners that he holds, these big like stag night dinners, which have Guinevere sitting there, and presumably some of her ladies are around, but it's mainly just a bunch of guys crashing up against one another, drinking too much. Arthur maintained certain rules. Arthur would not eat until all were served. Everybody else has to get their food first, which is generally recognized as good manners today. We in America tend to take our rules about what good manners are from the British, and we're gonna, we will take this. You wait until all of your guests are seated and served, and then you can begin to eat. He's very into the formality of the courtly tradition. And he has some of his own. He is, again, a very young man, and lots of energy, and likes to have a good time. And he insists that before anything really happens, before anybody, gets to eat or anything, that everybody provides a game or a story or some sort of marvel for him. He wants to be wowed. And he insists on this. Now, here, that seems a little self-indulgent, to me at least. That, okay, yeah, you come, but you're my guest at dinner, but I expect you to sing for your supper, so go. And if you don't eat. That to me just seems like, okay, the other side of service is also a kind of inherent selfishness, maybe, at least in this practice. They give a stars lineup of who is there, not really naming a lot of people. You get the sense that everybody is in attendance, but it's not they're not singling out like, oh, look, there's Lancelot. You get a couple of names here and there, but it doesn't really come up. They are generally just known as the knights. They are somewhat anonymous within that. Now, this allows Gawain, who is, in a lot of other tales, kind of the backbencher. This allows him the prominence to step forward. He's like, oh, okay, this is his story. All right, I'll buy that. But it does create a certain curious dynamic once danger walks through the door. And danger does walk through the door, of course, in the person of the Green Knight. You go from great celebration. Now on the subject of supper, I'll say no more, as it's obvious to everyone that no one went without, because another sound, a new sound, suddenly drew near, which might signal the king to sample his supper, for barely had the horns finished blowing their breath, and with starters just spooned to the seated guests, a fearful form appeared, framed in the door. You hear the alliteration going through there. But at a kind of high point in the celebration, when everybody's just really high on, being together, we've all been at that kind of party where, it's just great that we're all here together. They're celebrating themselves more than anything, particularly Christian here, I would argue. That's when the danger walks in the door, the Green Knight. A fearful form appeared framed in the door, a mountain of a man immeasurably high, a hulk of human from head to hips, so long and thick in his loins and his limbs, I should genuinely judge him to be half giant, or a most massive man, the mightiest of mortals. Big guy. A mountain of a man is the first description, which automatically, of course, the size of him, the imposing nature of him, but also the association. Well, a mountain is a characteristic of nature, and here is very clearly somebody who the description will be very much aligned with nature. But handsome too, like any horseman worth his horse, for despite the bulk and brawn of his body, his stomach and waist were slender and sleek. In fact, in all features he was finely formed, it seemed. Amazement seized their minds. No soul had ever seen a knight of such kind, entirely emerald green. Green! So he is a, strapping hulk of a man who happens to be green, which is extraordinary in many ways and notable in many ways, but it is somewhat shocking. Green obviously has a somewhat natural association. The color green is the sign of nature. In the Celtic heritage, Celtic pagan imagery is replete with green around images of fertility and associations of a kind of pagan nature cult. There have been a lot of research in this, scholars looking into the green man motif of literature of this period and before, especially in Ireland and Wales, and some very early England, and a lot of that is pretty convincing that there is an association there. Clearly, I would say the poet here is playing on that. So you have this walking image of nature just kind of burst in. But he's also quite handsome. Despite the bulk and brawn of his body, his stomach and waist were slender and sleek. Quite a yummy little specimen now, isn't he? You can get over the green. It ain't easy being green. We're given a long description of how he looks. Obviously, the green is the headline in that, but just the poet dwells on, this guy walks in, and then we're given an entire stanza of what he and his horse looks like. Actually, I think the horse takes up the next stanza too. And it's like, okay, I get it. I don't need this much description. Just tell me what's the deal with this guy. I'll buy that he's green. I can move on from there. But we're told about his clothing. We're told about the weapons he's carrying. He's carrying no weapons. His clothing does tend to be natural based. It's fur. I see ermine. He's wearing silk. These are all very natural fibers that you find in nature. All the details of his dress were difficult to describe, embroidered as it was with butterflies and birds, which again sounds a little like, he's wearing a 2-year-old's jammies, but it's the nature association that you need to focus on there, I would say. I mean, obviously also the silk, the butterflies, the birds, it's like he's a big green Liberace coming in. We'll get there. He comes in, everybody's just sort of aghast because this guy just sort of walks in out of nowhere on the middle of a Christmas party, and all of this dwelling on how he appears, the fact that he's not carrying any weapons, that he's carrying a sprig of holly, which is a symbol of peace. It's all his appearance, but we're getting impatient with the appearance as we're sitting there being told all of this description of his wardrobe. We want to know why he's there. We want to know who he is. We want to know what's going on underneath the appearance, and the poet seems to be playing with us, holding that back and saying, nope, not yet, not yet, not yet. Oh, it's frustrating. But he comes in and he just sort of looks around. All eyes are on him. The guy knows how to make an entrance. Again, kind of Liberace-ish. He's looking around, says, okay, who's in charge here? Which is kind of a dig. To walk into a king's hall and just say, well, I don't know, which one of you guys is the king? He knows exactly where he is. And he might even know who the king is, and he's just screwing with him. But he claims to not be able to recognize the king. And any king would be very offended by this because, of course, your natural right to be king is apparent to everyone. It is obvious. Your appearance is a dead giveaway. Divine right of kings, you are imbued with a special quality that is recognizable to others, that you are a king by right of God. This guy walks in, Mr. Green, and says, which one of you knuckleheads is in charge? A little bit of a dig, but one that cues on the idea of appearance. The Arthur, the king, steps up and says, well, excuse me, I'm Arthur. And, he expects everybody to go, ooh. And for the most part, his people probably do. The green guy does not. Green guy does not blink. And there is this scene that ensues where the Green Knight challenges the court and taunts them. And Arthur is saying, well, if you want to fight, you'll get it. I've got all my best men here. And curiously, we're not told any of them are really piping up at this point. Galahad, Lancelot, Ivan, all of these guys, we're not hearing anything. Presumably they're there, but they're not really raising their hand at this point. And Green Knight looks around, like, yeah, you guys don't look like much. In fact, I'm looking around, and Tolkien calls them beardless boys, which is, kind of, it's clear, it's obviously a dig, but my favorite is actually Armitage's. Let me think, where'd it go? Armitage calls him bum-fluffed bairns. Now, I don't know what that is, and I don't know if that's necessarily closer to the original, or how much license he's taking. Bairn sounds like it's a very Celtic word, so maybe he's bringing in something specifically Celtic that might be in the poem, might not be in the poem, but one that Tolkien was really kind of shying against. I don't know. But I love that. Bum-fluffed bairns. I don't know what it means. Honestly, I don't want to know. But it sounds like a great put-down. So he is goading these people. He is tempting them. Tempting is the key. He is trying to tempt them into a fight. He's trying to tempt them to come at him and take him on. He makes a very clear point that in his appearance, he is not dressed for battle. He is not carrying a weapon. He's not wearing armor. He's just an ordinary guy. An ordinary guy who's wearing, birds and butterflies embroidered into his clothing. Specifically, also, significantly, I would say, he's also said to be wearing no shoes. All of this fine detail work on his clothing, but he couldn't get a pair of shoes. And, it's wintertime. You don't go barefoot in wintertime. Shoes. Shoes are a sign of, I would say, civilization. Shoes are a sign of some sophistication. Barefoot, well, that's nature. That's natural. Men were not supposed to wear shoes. Go barefoot the natural way. And it feels good in the summertime, less so in the wintertime. But I would say that here we have a sign of the height of civilization in Arthur's court, Camelot, which is patient zero, if you will, for the entire English tradition of civilization. And it is coming up against this nature-associated, barefoot wild man who's very, very pleasant, and aside from teasing and taunting a little bit, there's no outward sign that he's being particularly boisterous, aside from the whole bursting into the party he wasn't invited to thing. But that he announces what he calls, he announces what is known as a beheading game, which is a familiar motif in a lot of literature at the time, a lot of this knights in shining armor stuff, where they promise to two knights compete in a game where they try and behead one another. One takes a shot, and then a year later, the other one comes back and returns the blow. And the Green Knight announces this, saying so, like, well, okay, everybody around here, you guys all look like, you know, bum fluff bairns. Maybe he's not expecting much of a fight, or maybe he's just trying to really rile them up. Arthur steps forward and says, well, I'll do it. And he goes and he grabs this axe, and he's ready to jump in. And over on the dais, the table, you get Gawain starting to raise his hand. Now, Gawain is mentioned for the second time in this poem at this point, sitting next to Guinevere. Guinevere has no lines, but he is mentioned that he is sitting next to her. He is sitting with the woman in this broad association of men, in this big stag party on Christmas Eve, where all these big burly guys are sitting there chest bumping one another. He's sitting with the woman. There's a meaning there. There's a symbolism there. There's an association there. We'll get there. He says, you know, hello? I'll do it. Uncle Arthur, let me in. He is the king's nephew, Gawain is. And the king's nephew in many tales like this is always sort of one of the special knights. It is always a point of some honor and some conspicuousness because of the complicated relationship of not quite father, but father figure, and there are all these dynamics that different poems take advantage of. He jumps in and says, you know, let me do it. He feigns a little false modesty, I would say, saying, you know, I am the weakest of your warriors and feeblest of wit. The loss of my life would be least lamented. This doesn't really jive with a lot of the evidence we're going to get to, but you get a sense that, well, he's trying to be humble here, or at least appear that way. And perhaps that is another kind of egotism, however, because you can be really self-effacing when you have confidence that nobody's going to believe it. Arthur goes along with it. Okay, fine, you want your shot. All the other knights of the round table, again, still very anonymous, still very grouped together in a kind of aggregate of, yeah, sure, let him go. They're all for it. And so Arthur swears them in, essentially. You know, he held up his hand to give young Gawain the blessing of God. Arthur invokes the abstract ideal. Arthur believes in forms. Arthur believes in traditions. Arthur believes in the highest civilization, which is Christianity. Green Knight and Gawain square off. Neither one blinks. Gawain has to promise the Green Knight something now. The Green Knight, when they're staring at one another, says, not taking a whole lot of faith, not invoking God and the abstract, he demands to know from Gawain, okay, give me your word that you're going to go through with this. I will lay down my neck now. You take your best shot at me, and 1 year from now, you will hunt me down and give me my recompense. The medieval world is loaded with these examples of, you know, letting a knight go and saying, okay, now you be back here in 1 year. It's kind of ridiculous. But take that as it may, the Green Knight demands the personal assurance based on Gawain's individual integrity, not the abstract, you know, seal of God over the proceedings. Significant. Gawain goes up, gets the sword, Green Knight lays down. Again, he heaped his hair to the crown of his head, the nape of his neck, now naked and ready. Again, sounds a little sexy there. I don't know, just me. Gawain, boom! Head goes falling off, tumbling across the floor, blood spurting everywhere. Everybody's sort of like kicking it, and just, you know, it's a big mess. But in one sentence, I love this. Blood gutters brightly against the green gown, yet the man doesn't shudder or stagger or sink, but trudges toward them with those tree trunk legs, tree trunks, nature, and rummages around, reaches at his feet and cups hold of his head and hoists it high, and strides to his steed, snatches the bridle, steps into the stirrup and swings into the saddle, still gripping his head by a handful of hair. Which is great that they get all that into a single sentence, because it's just so preposterous. That's where the story really goes quite off the rails. I mean, you know, okay, the green thing is weird. That's a sign of, you know, that's weird. But the guy loses his head, and then the body just sort of goes over and picks it up, grabs it by the hair, and starts walking around like Lazarus and Dante. That's where we know we're in a very different world than perhaps we thought we were. We are now in the realm of magic. This is a bizarre development, and we're only meant to wonder. And because it is all presented in that single sentence, I would say that it helps augment it, because we, as the readers, are in the same position as all the other nameless people in that room who are just like, what the hell was that? What's going on here? Something weird, something magical, something horrifying. Their game suddenly got much more serious because, well, when this guy volunteered to lay his neck down first in this game, it would have been very simple. Okay, all Gawain has to do is get a clear shot with that axe. It's big and it's not easy to wield, but okay, if he did that and he could actually strike through and sever the head, well, the game's pretty much over at that point, most people would expect. But no! Other forces are at work here, other dynamics. And this is where it gets scary. Green Knight walks away. He repeats his reliance on Gawain's personal obligation to seek him out. And then everybody's just sort of standing there, because this guy, carrying his own head, gets back on the horse, trots out the door, and he's gone. Everybody's just sitting around in this party, presumably a fair-sized puddle of blood and goo on the floor, and they're just kind of looking around at one another like, you know, huh? Arthur, the host, as a good host does, tries to smooth it over and get the party back online, pretending that everything was fine. And although King Arthur was awestruck at heart, no sign of it showed. Instead, he spoke to his exquisite queen with courteous words. "Dear lady, don't be daunted by this deed today. It's in keeping that such strangeness should occur at Christmas, between sessions of banter and seasonal song, amid the lively pastimes of ladies and lords. Nothing to see here. Oh, well, these things happen. Don't worry about it. Let's get back to having some fun. Hey, strike up the music." He puts on this happy face, this disguise of courtesy, this appearance of I don't know, sang-froid, coolness. This is keep calm and carry on for the British example. It is an attempt to just ignore reality and superimpose your own understanding of it, your own reality. It is putting forward a very different appearance from whatever you might be thinking beneath. He's pretending. He is retreating into the trappings of courtesy. Well, we're at a party, something has gone amiss, we will recover, and we will go on unperturbed. How very British of you. This is Arthur, retreating to the formalities of Camelot, despite the horrifying and extraordinarily portentous threat that has just been laid down.